Okay. Corinth was what I called a young old city. The ancient Corinth had been destroyed in about 150 BC and was rebuilt by Julius Caesar to be a capital of the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And that was in 44 BC. So when Paul comes along, it's not even 100 years later. And it's a thriving capital that's at a huge trade and commerce center. All kinds of travelers coming through. A very young city, consequently a city without strong traditions. The biggest tradition it was extraordinarily diverse. And diversity makes for a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of I'll do it my way approach to life. It had an anything goes type atmosphere, a lot like what is spoken of Las Vegas now. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Corinth was a lot like that. It was the prostitution center of the Roman Empire. What a claim to fame, huh? Paul was in Corinth, according to Acts chapter 18. Paul was in Corinth from early 50 to late 51. I keep wanting to put 19s in front of those numbers when I say them, but there are no 19s there. It's just 50 to 51. And the earliest letters in the Corinthian correspondence were written maybe a couple years later, 53, 54-ish, but it was an ongoing correspondence. To help understand how early this is, there are no gospels yet. Mark was not written until about 70 AD, more or less. Luke and Matthew, 15-ish years later. John, not till after that, not till the end of the century. At the time that Paul visited Corinth, there were at least 10 different religions being practiced in the city. In addition to several synagogues and this very nascent Christian community that Paul gathered. So there's a whole lot going on. The Christian community is probably 50 to 100 people. It's small. When we're reading Paul's letters, we need to remember we have one side of an ongoing conversation, especially the Corinthian correspondence. It's called that because there are several letters. The first one is referenced in chapter 5, but we don't have that letter. Unless maybe part of it is hidden within the volume we call 2 Corinthians, which appears to be parts of several letters that have been kind of mooshed together. But the first letter is probably just not there. So anytime you're reading, especially in Corinthians, it's good to ask ourselves, what is Paul talking about? What situation sparks him saying this? What situation causes him to say that? These aren't things that just kind of come out of the air and he thinks he might need to say it. He's responding to something. What is his mood? What is his intent here? Is he angry? Is he the disappointed parent? Is he praising them? What's going on there? Now, what we find going on in Corinthians, in 1 Corinthians anyway, as we read it, apparently there's a lot of taking sides going on. And when the community is small, there's not a whole lot of people to take sides with. You've got 50 to 100 people, and in the beginnings of the letter to the Corinthians, we have some saying I'm with Apollos, some saying I'm with Cephas, and others saying I'm with Paul, and others saying I'm with Christ. Which in theory might be the best position, but when they're saying it to take sides, no, it's not a good position. It's just a case of claimed superiority. There is intellectual elitism going on that sparks Paul's statement about wisdom and foolishness. You might remember that for the first part of the letter. There are members of the church suing other members of the church in civil courts. There is spiritual competition. My gift is better than your gift. There's various kinds of sexual immorality going on. And when we get to those lovely sections about the Lord's Supper, Paul is actually saying, quit it. Because what they're eating together is not any holy moment. It is the rich bringing out their lavish meals while the poor sit over on the other side of the room with a crust of bread. And they call it the Lord's Supper. So this is what's happening that causes Paul to write all of this wonderful stuff that we read that has our hearts going pity pat.
Lots of problems.
Lots of problems. Okay, do you have your Bibles open perchance already to 1 Corinthians 12? I'd like us to read it aloud so that we all hear it as well as see it. And Grace, would you like to read? Okay, let's start. I'm just going to break it up into pieces and just read continuously around the table. Okay. I'll start with 1 Corinthians 12, 1 through 3. And if you pick up at 4 through 11, right? And then 12 and 13. And Jennifer, 14 through 19.
Page 175 then.
Oh,
I went to Chronicle side. Oh, yeah, 74, sorry.
looks like you're in the Old Testament section.
Map of this whole thing.
Ah,
There is a map on page 117, the Acts of Apostles, but it doesn't show forms.
Oh.
And then the other map is right at the beginning of the Gospels. There's on page.
mhm. Hey, what? You should keep looking for maps because that may be really helpful.
Yeah.
And we'll go on with Lynn with the reading at verse 20. Okay.
You know what, in the library, there's a whole set of maps that we brought.
Okay.
That's quite wonderful, that might be helpful. Yeah.
Okay. And would you like to read as well?
Sure,
Okay, and pick up at 27 to finish.
okay.
Okay,
Mhm.
1 through 3.
I'll read 1 through 3 and you take 4 through 11. Okay. Now concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be ignorant. You know that when you were Gentiles, you were enticed and led astray to idols that could not speak. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking by the Spirit of God ever says, let Jesus be cursed. And no one can say, Jesus is Lord, except by the Holy Spirit.
Now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit, and there are varieties of services, but the same Lord, and there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles. To another prophecy. To another the discernment of spirits. In another various kinds of tongues. To another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses.
But just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free. We were all made to drink the one Spirit. Indeed, the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot would say, because I am not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And if the ear would say, because I am not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less a part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the hearing be? If the whole body were hearing, where would the sense of smell be? But as it is, God arranged for the members of the body, each one of them as he chose. I forget where I start.
Through 19.
Okay, if all were a single member, where would the body be?
As it is, there are many members, yet one body. I cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor again the head to the feet. I have no need of you. On the contrary, the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable, and those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor, and our less respectable members are treated with great respect. Whereas our more respectable members do not need them. But God has so arranged the body, giving the greater honor to the inferior member, that there may be no dissension within the body. But the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, and all suffer together with it, one member is honored, all rejoice together with it.
Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then deeds of power, then gifts of healing, forms of assistance, forms of leadership, various kinds of tongues. Are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak in tongues? Do all interpret? But strive for the greater gifts, and I will show you a still more excellent way.
Who knows what follows? The still more excellent way. What's next?
That's me.
No, no, we're not gonna read farther, but who
Yeah.
knows what he's talking about there?
Yeah. Love.
Oh, yes, that's where the love chapter is. Yeah. Okay. You're on.
Oh, okay. So we've kind of taken care of the context. The first question is kind of there before us already, thanks to Renee's whole cursory examination of the setting.
Of course, there is right.
Uh-huh.
Helpful and personal.
But just to make sure that we're all up to speed, what are the main issues or questions about church that are addressed here in this passage?
Division and squabbling.
Mhm.
Yep. And
Judgment and evaluation of one another and of self.
Can you say it again?
Judgment
Judgment,
of
yeah.
one another and of myself and apparently sometimes a pejorative or dismissive kind of way.
And here in chapter 12, I would also, I approve of your word judgment, but let's broaden it even farther. And recognize that in this chapter, Paul is trying to help a very judgmental congregation to have judgment, self-evaluation, and to recognize,
Accurate discernment.
to recognize with good judgment how everybody relates to everyone else. I'm gonna put in my 2 cents worth, and it might be about 3 cents worth. I think that maybe what the Apostle Paul is doing here in chapter 12 is helping a congregation that has been very experienced in religions of the individual in their relationship with God, and is helping them to recognize that if you are going to be a follower of Jesus Christ, you cannot be an individual. You are one, but you must be in relationship with other people because we are all one body, which is Jesus Christ. The church is, in fact, the Christ here on earth. But not if there's going to be squabbling.
Another theme, I think, is that everything comes from God through the Holy Spirit. This is, this particular gift, this is not yours. This comes from God. This is any of these gifts and manifestations from God through the Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, the idea that these things that you can do are gifts, not talents. They are dispensed by God, not honed by you. And they're for the good of the whole.
So is this passage, for that matter, is 1 Corinthians helpful to Vista La Mesa in its context? Or the second set of questions there is, are these issues or questions relevant to our church?
I certainly think they are.
Because it's a similar context as the church at Corinth experienced, or?
I think there are similarities.
Mm.
Yeah, in terms of, being a very individualistic culture. Yeah.
Well, I think too, that our church individually is very different. And if you just put them into a huge crowd, would we really gravitate to these individuals because they are different? No, but because we have a similar feeling and love of God, then we do come together, and then we find that, we really are more like them than God.
Yeah.
So that's how we get our church.
Other than the problem of individualism, is there anything else that we are similar to the Corinthian church on?
Well, as we were saying before, is, kind of the universal human tendencies that don't seem to change because of place or time, the judgmentalism, the criticism, the shame, the feeling less than or more than, those kinds of things. Yeah, I would assume go on here because they go on everywhere and they're human things. Well, I don't know about the church there, except after the influence of Paul, but I think most of us, come every Sunday and say, okay, kind of messed up this week. Oh, that's a good idea. I think I should be doing that. When the message from Comfort and these class just being together. So maybe we're more inclined to learn and try to prove ourselves than this was at the beginning of all of this.
I can't understand what you're saying. I'm sorry.
Well, maybe it wasn't very clear to me.
No, it's the mask.
Yeah.
Well, what I was saying, Carrie, that group of people versus our group of people, that we do come to church and we do, for the most part, try to be better people, following what we hear from the pulpit, following from what we read here in the Bible. I don't know what they were doing, but I think many of us are more motivated to become better and more spiritual, more godlike. Maybe. Okay.
This passage has provided an excellent youth group study many times over the years. Where I bring out crutches and slings and various, various bits of apparatus, blindfolds. And then send the youth group off to do a task like make supper or, straighten all of the pews, all the hymn books and such in the pews. And everyone has to participate. And it's their responsibility to one another to make sure that everyone can participate. And then when we debrief that activity, they realize how important it is to have eyes to see the mess that needs to be done. But if your hand can't reach it, then someone else has to do that for you. If you can't get around well, people have to help you do that. It's an eye-opening thing for young people that I don't usually do with adults, because we tend to have our own kinds of handicapping conditions already if we've lived very long. But it can really give folks a chance to think about that when you have to put on some kind of loss.
That's a really creative approach. Yes, I think that's a really creative approach to it. Instead of lecturing, it's like doing it. You're, oh yeah, I can't do this. Oh, maybe. I think that was a great idea.
I served a church, before we move on to the next question with Renee, I served a church in Illinois that within the month that I arrived there as interim minister, I, looking back over the records, noticed that the same people were nominated and elected to the board over a 30-year span of time. And so in a meeting with the board, when they called for my report, I had a few questions to ask. And one of them was, why is it I see none of the younger, the more recent members who, yeah, I'm cuckoo, I agree. Especially when I put on this jacket. When it's time to nominate officers to the board and to nominate elders, deacons and such, why is it that the crowd that has joined the congregation, and they were almost half of the church, why is it that their names never show up and haven't for 20, 30 years? And they had to talk long and hard about that to figure it out. And finally, they discovered the common denominator was every member of the board at that time had been baptized by one minister who had been there for 26 years. And they were the only authorized members of the church. Everybody else was just an attendee. But the authority rested with those who had been baptized by Paul,
And
so
God follows.
so to speak. And there were people in the younger crowd, the more recent arrivals, who were excellent at recognizing the leading of Jesus Christ and were following, not, to say I follow Jesus doesn't mean you are literally following him, but that you have become a student of what he has taught and have made that your life choice. So that every decision that you make is determined by what Jesus taught. That's what it means to follow Jesus. And there was one Sunday school class that was amazing in their ability to reach out in mission, not on behalf of the congregation, not even on behalf of their own Sunday school class, but they were doing it because Jesus Christ said so. And the Lord had no clue. But that's where their future strength as a church lay. They had taken almost a year to finally help the Lord to recognize that they had been relegating some of the spiritual gifts of the congregation to the bottom shelf. And they had elevated themselves to the top shelf in importance. That's what, no,
Okay.
long time ago in Illinois. I learned a lot from them. That Paul is very relevant in our day. So if you are aware of that sort of thing happening here, it might be a good idea to say so to the people who have ears to hear.
And to the nominating committee.
Very
Yes.
good. Yes.
And when the nominating committee approaches you, even if it's something new to you, say yes. Give it a try.
Please do
Are you
this,
on the
one of
nominating committee?
programs.
Why, yes.
Yeah. So
Again.
now that segues us into our next set of questions.
Well, we have already been talking about, are these issues or questions relevant to our church?
Mhm.
How is it similar and how are we different from what was happening in Corinth?
Well, that's what I was asking.
Yeah.
For here.
Oh, you're here, okay. I didn't realize we'd covered that already. Okay. How is the image of church presented in this passage, reflected in the way that we do things here at Vista La Mesa? And how is it different?
Well, I think in regards to that conversation we just had, that's not necessarily true. It could be true here, but it's not necessarily true here that they keep the same people. The problem here is trying to get people to get involved. So you might get a new member of the church, and they might find themselves being board president within a short period of time. And that can work negative too. I'll give you an example. I was involved with girls softball years and years ago. I've been involved in lots of different things involved with athletics, etc. But it was girls softball. And one of the things they were concerned about, the one meeting I went to, was they needed a little bit more reporting done to the newspaper. Well, I had a pretty good contact in the newspaper, so I said, sure, I'll go ahead and do it. I had only been involved for a short period of time. My daughter, meanwhile, told me she don't want to play softball anymore. Now what to do? I volunteered to help get this publicity out, and the daughter didn't want to play. And at the same time, I was teaching her tennis, and she wanted to do more tennis and less softball. Well, anyway, I just disappeared. I didn't go in and say I'm not going to do it. I didn't go in and say I was going to do it. I just never was there again. That was not a very good way of dealing with things, but that's what happens sometimes with a new person that comes in. They, I don't know if I want to do that, and they don't want to maybe take the responsibility of just telling people I'm not going to do it. I just wasn't there anymore.
Yes.
Presto gone.
One of the difficult challenges for a nominating committee or for anyone who's trying to draw people in is to find the right place of fit. Very recently, a family member was asked to serve as vice chair of the board, which is not this church. Absolutely the wrong question for her. That's not her gift. If she took it, it would bore her to death and drive her out the door, not draw her in. And so finding the right place of fit for someone who wants to be included is always a challenge. We talk about prayerful discernment in the church. I hear phrases like that from time to time. And what they're referring to is generally is that task of finding the right fit, the round peg for the round hole and not for the square hole. Because there is that place in the body but you can't make a foot do what a hand does. Try getting your toes to write a check.
It can be done, but it takes a lot
Yeah,
of struggle.
exactly. And I don't think there are any easy answers to how that works.
And there are many things going on these days that makes this even more difficult than it was when I was a kid. For instance, anti-authoritarianism, the tendency of our younger generations to not be interested in joining institutional groups. And it causes me to wonder if maybe it would be helpful if we of our generation actually paid close attention to what's really going on in that regard, and to give each other permission to downplay the importance of a board. Now, that's fighting words, I know, but the longer I served in the church, the more frustrated I became with the fact that too often the board was the tail that wagged the dog. And so consequently, boards and their committees had the tendency to be a substitute for the mission of Jesus Christ. When in fact, the board is here only because in our world, different from that in Paul's day, the church is a nonprofit charitable religious organization that the Secretary of State in each of our states wants to abide by certain rules in order to maintain that status, and a church board is required.
But I think what you're saying makes sense, because I was thinking about that is maybe it's incumbent on us to be a little more creative in how we think about the tasks and the missions and how those get accomplished, and how it gets maybe divided up into different kinds of pieces or directions. Amongst other things, and I think probably we should not make assumptions about people, and we should not give up asking too, but.
That's right.
Yeah.
We do tend to assume, and often out of the best of intentions, oh, they're too busy. Oh, there's a lot going on in their family. Oh, they don't feel very well, we think, all kinds of things like that.
It's, yeah. It's so hard to balance a pastoral concern for an individual with misguided assumptions about that person. And instead of simply asking that person, I see a place for you in our church to be doing this. Is that something that might give you joy? And then let them say, I'm too tied up with getting my daughter back and forth between softball and tennis. I can't take that on right now, but you're right, that would give me joy. Let me think about this.
Because we don't want to burden people, we do want to guard each one's dignity.
Exactly, yes, to honor their ability to say yes and to say no. And that person may say, that is not my gift at all. I don't have that organizational skill to do anything, but I love to do hands-on work. Do you have hands-on things I can do? Or someone can say, using a screwdriver and a hammer, I never know which is which, but I am really good at administrative tasks. So are there things of that nature that you need? Figuring out whether a person is a hand or a foot or an ear or an eye. And too often nominating committees meet and they make the list and they prioritize that list. Well, this is the top of the list. This person is the top for this job. I'll call them. If I don't get there, I'll call the next one on the list, and so on. And we're trying to fill a slot. Oh, I know how, I've been there. Done that a lot of times.
for me, and I won't belabor this point, I'll end it with this. Continue on with this.
Mhm.
I was a member of the nominating committee a couple of times. I didn't like that job.
It's a tough job.
but-
It really is.
I did my part, I did what they asked me to do
Yeah.
and so forth. Then I became a board chair. And the job wasn't so bad for me. Except the nominating committee, right? When Rebecca would say, it's time for the nominating committee. Well, that meant that John had to go out and figure out who's gonna be on the nominating committee and ask those people to be on it. I didn't wanna do it. So I would kind of just forget that she said that. And wander off, and about a couple of weeks later, what about the nominating committee? Oh, yeah, I'm on that.
Yeah.
And I would delay and delay and delay. Usually,
An honest man.
but it was, the rest of the job wasn't too bad, but that one part of it was difficult for me anyhow. I found that if I got the chairman of the board, then that made my job easier. Once I got that, and I wanted a particular person to be the chairman, and that particular person volunteered twice for me, saved my neck, to do this. And then from there, it was still my responsibility to get the other board members, but I thought once I had that guy in charge, we were gonna be okay.
Mhm.
And it turned out. that
Yeah.
it worked out real
And
well.
when you get the right person as board chair, things can really click along.
Yeah,
What happens when you get the wrong person as board chair?
in my situation, well, it can be a problem. Because if you get, just like, I was the board chair, and the number one job is to get the nominating committee going, and I was hiding someplace around behind this chair and that chair, so that can be a problem,
Yeah.
because then Rebecca hasn't chased me down to get the job.
Yeah.
So,
I'm going to insert something here, the name of Bill Eason, who was a Methodist minister in Texas. The bishop sent him to a very troubled congregation in San Antonio, asking him to help that church close its doors because they were landlocked. They had parking on the street until both streets that intersected right where the church stood widened to 4-lane streets. All of a sudden, all of the curb parking that was available was gone, and they had no parking lot. There was a parking garage that was back on the back side of that block that the church was on. But suddenly they had a drop off in church members because who wants to pay a parking fee to go to church? The nearest parking lot that was available was 2 or 3 blocks away. And so the church had shrunk down to only about 35, 40 people. But when Bill Eason arrived there, he discovered a congregation that had learned to be extremely vital. The last holdouts understood what it meant to be church. And so he told the bishop, I know what you told me to do, but I'm not doing it. This thing could work. They suspended every organizational need to be a church, according to the Secretary of State. They suspended all of it. They stopped doing everything that it meant previously to be an organized institution. And they started homing in on what does it mean to be a church that does what chapter 12 says, to be led by the Spirit of God, to put fully on the table and out there in the neighborhood our gifts. They didn't have decision-making meetings. They had no organizational meetings. They had no committees to decide or approve any of this stuff because Bill said, if it is of God, whatever it is that our imaginations tell us to do next, if that's from God, it will flourish. If it's not of God, it'll just die. So let's start making a few errors of judgment and do as much as we can to stumble on to what God's will is. That congregation is still there.
So how does
It's
it-
not only still there, but it is much larger than it ever was back when they had parking on the street. And the main reason why is because they have a very minimal board. It only takes care of things to satisfy the Secretary of State. And everything else is about people who are gathered into groups very naturally because of friendship connections and because of common interest in doing what Jesus taught in their particular calling, their spiritual gift, if you will. Bill Easom has not been their minister for a long time. And every new minister who comes along is warned by the congregation, don't mess this up. This is run by the Spirit, not a board, not a preacher, but you're welcome to join in any way you want.
How did they get around the parking challenge?
Well,
The,
that, just the general organization of it.
the mission of the church became so important that people no longer cared about the parking charge.
Yeah,
Right.
they would walk blocks to get there. And
Yeah.
Sunday morning wasn't a formality kind of a thing. It was an opportunity to come together and to celebrate, finding out from one another, various groups, the terrific, fantastic stuff that had been going on, because on Sunday morning, they get together to encourage one another's work on behalf of Jesus Christ. And the dispossessed, the powerless, the hungry, the no accounts in San Antonio. It's an amazing story, and it gives me great hope that from time to time, a church can actually stop doing what turns the younger folks off and start doing what Paul told the Corinthian church works.
Let's read something. Oh, let's,
What?
on that note, let's read something from Corinthians that may help us in spirit and accomplish what may need to be done in physical form, young and old. Looking at Corinthians 3 down to 11. Okay, I'll read it for you. For no other foundation can anyone lay other than which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now, if anyone builds on the foundation, gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, straw, each man's work will become manifest. For the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed with fire, and the fire will test that sort of work that each has done. If the work which any man has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If any man's work is burned up, he will suffer a loss, though he himself will be saved, but only through fire. In other words, I think of fire as being just a more difficult path. Okay. Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you? For if anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him. For God's temple is holy, and that temple are you. So I'm gonna just leave it to you. That's in each of us, and that's something we can put in physical form. There's a young man right there. Maybe he likes to be involved in something that's in church. So it's the activities, perhaps, that we need to attract them with to become more involved in church. And our activities as being Christians, that's our foundations. So we won't lose that.
Yeah.
But we can have creativities, and as being seniors, we can be, what do you call it? The leaders, essentially. And you can have your apprentice forms, journeyman forms, that type of structure, or maybe focus on that in the physical form within the church.
Yeah, Bill Easom says that the Church of Jesus Christ rests on a foundation of relationship.
Right.
Organization is immaterial. Relationships will cause organization to materialize as long as it's needed. And then when it's no longer needed in the world, then something else replaces it that is created by those relationships that are driven by the Spirit of God. It's the sort of thing that you have to trust. And if you have a great deal of trouble trusting the process of the Spirit of God, then you will not feel comfortable unless you have boards, committees, subcommittees, and task forces. Because, some of us are just very uncomfortable with the unknown outcome.
And I feel like sometimes there's a desire to keep things the way they've always been. That was stable, that was good, we were making it work, but its time has really passed. And it's time to rethink.
Yes.
And, yeah, really interesting ideas about bringing in new people. I think
It-
are humans and we tend to get
Right.
stuck.
And that was in the same book, Corinthians, because that's what he's dealing with, Paul.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So let's take these last two questions together.
I'd like to speak to the organizational matter
Oh,
first.
sure, okay.
Yeah, Steve is right, that we tend to rely on organization first as our assurance that things will be done decently and in order. Yeah. But in Genesis, we read in the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth was a chaotic chaos, and darkness formed over the face of the deep. Now, that is my translation, because chaotic chaos is not really a very meaningful term, but it's literally what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew word is chaos multiplied. It's a chaos of chaos. And it's from there that God begins to create. When we are too organized from a human standpoint, we haven't left room for God to create. And so we tend to squeeze God out. We don't have that box on our organizational charts too much. And so I toss that into the discussion as a reminder that we can be over-organized and become a very human organization rather than an organic, living, growing body that God is creating.
Right, and in that parallel sense, net chaos, not going back to the Big Bang, but more recent times, few billion years. Let's say the asteroid belt, that's rather chaotic. Right,
Yes.
all these little particles floating around out there in our system. But at the beginning of it, this material joined and formed, well, we can say God took the material and formed the earth, formed the planets, whatever else. So we have to take what we have
Yeah,
Yeah.
and build upon that.
Yeah.
Renee and I once did that in spades. We were called as co-pastors for a church in Southern Illinois. Right after Renee graduated from seminary. What we did not know, but sensed when we interviewed with the search committee, was that they were in dire straits, or they were in a great deal of self-doubt, and they were very unsure of themselves. Out in the parking lot, one of the search committee members caught up to us, and in the dark of night told us out of the corner of her mouth, so to speak, what we needed to know, that things had been rather fraught, and that she was concerned that we might come to their church without warning. After we arrived, we decided to come anyway, but after we arrived, we found out that at a board meeting, a month or two before we arrived, an actual physical confrontation broke loose, in which several people were hauled off to the hospital. One with a broken jaw. His assailant had a broken hand. And there was $18,000 worth of, or $1,800 worth of damage done to the fellowship hall where the meeting took place. Chairs were thrown. Yeah, and from that chaos, Renee and I enjoyed some of the most wonderful our ministry. 9 years, we'd like to have stayed longer, but everything that we agreed that we would try to accomplish with them had been accomplished, and they were getting kind of stuck in a new rut, and it was time for us to move on. Otherwise, I think we would still be there. It's about relationships, and when you can develop relationships that have the Spirit of God about them, all of those petty, unimportant organizational differences melt away and become very, very unimportant.
I think that's one of the things that Paul and I is saying in this chapter 12. That it is all about the Spirit of God that other
Yes, groups that have the task of teachings of Jesus to make real the mission of the congregation of the church, of close bonds of friendship, but a common bond of a sense of God's movement in our lives that we've got to answer, that just must be answered, because God wants good and great things to happen in the chaos of the community where we find ourselves.
And it is 10 o'clock and time to close.
Well, not by that clock, it's 2 minutes to go.
10 o'clock.
I leave it to you, we leave it to you to consider the last two questions then. We kind of already have touched on them, but take it further in your own thought and conversation you might have with others.
We will see you again in 2 weeks when we talk about all the tree images that speak to church.
Thank you.
If you want more hair-raising stories, you know those, do you?
Yes.
Goodbye, Kathy.
What is going on in Santee right now has nothing to do with, well, it does YMCA. You've heard about the